great to be back. I appreciate the chance to join at the Minnesota Pork Board, Pork Association, Pork Congress. It's always a real honor, and I appreciate any feedback that I get from you. So we'll talk a little bit about what's happening, but I really hope we have some time to discuss, because that's where I learn a lot from what you're seeing and hearing. Okay, before we get started, I always like to make sure that you know where the money's come from. It's important for transparency, but also to thank the organizations that have sponsored my research for many years, because we couldn't get it done without them. You see the USDA, special thanks to National and State Pork Board, and then our Rapid Response Fund in Minnesota, as well as some very important industrial partners, Preserve and Midwest Microtech, and also our SDEC group, who are listed right here. All of these organizations contribute funds to our university for graduate student sponsorship, project funding, as well as operating our research facility. So we couldn't function without these groups of people, corporate as well as practice. You see a lot of Minnesota on this list, particularly some of the veterinary clinics. Pipestone, Fairmont Swine Vet Center, Cannon Valley, all in Minnesota. Just a lot of great Minnesota activity at the university, and we really appreciate that. And I'm going to talk about air filtration, but I want to be sure you also know that I come at it from a scientific approach, not from a financial approach. I have no patents or arrangements, consulting fees, retainers, etc. with companies that make filtration equipment. I'm very interested in the science and the application and the use of this technology to solve the problem of area spread of PRRS between farms. So that's my connection. Okay, so the topics for today. We'll start with a little bit of background. We'll talk about preventing reinfection, working together, and some conclusions and time to discuss at the very end. So a little bit of background. I don't know if you know much about me. I have 2 children and my wife. You see we're in the canyon of the Yellowstone right there. But other than my family, PRRS has been and is my life. It's really all I've ever done. I came out of vet school from Minnesota in '87 and basically went into practice in a swine clinic in west central Minnesota. Got right involved with PRRS right when it emerged as mystery swine disease back in the late 80s and early 90s. And so in the 1990s, I was experiencing PRRS like many of you do. I went and did my PhD at the University of Minnesota while I was still a practitioner from 93 to 96 because I was so frustrated with my inability to solve problems for producers. So I studied it for a period of time in the mid-90s. And then I left practice on purpose to specifically research PRRS in the area of transmission and biosecurity. So from 99 to the present, up to this very moment, I've been researching this disease. And so you do the math on that, and I'm 52 years old. That's about 40% of my life is all I've worked on is this disease. Now, you can say I'm persistent, but you also might consider me in a different light. So here's the virus. It's given me the big L, right there. Can you spell loser? I mean, what a crazy way to build your career working on this, very, very difficult disease. So sometimes this is how I feel. But actually, I'm very excited about some of the progress we've made. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. Regarding PRRS, I am the eternal optimist. I really believe that we are in the last decade of this disease. And we'll put that out for discussion later on. But we have made so much progress in the last few years. And there is so much happening. And there are so many people working on new and exciting innovations that could open the door for even more success in the future that I see that we're going to get to the bottom of this thing. We will solve this problem, and we'll talk about the last decade at the end. So I am very optimistic. Why am I optimistic? Well, first of all, we have good veterinary leadership. The veterinarians have come together and are speaking the same language as we have to get rid of this disease from our pigs. This is a position statement I wrote when I was the president of the ASV, and it's a position statement from the American Association of Swine Veterinarians saying that eradication of PRRS from the North American pig population is a long-term goal. It's kind of like drawing the line in the sand. Okay? We don't know exactly how we're going to get there yet. We don't know how long it's going to take, and we're going to be very careful and not make mistakes along the way. But we got to get to that eventual long-term goal. Reason number 2 I'm optimistic is we have producer leadership. You might remember last March at Pork Forum, this NPPC resolution on PRRS virus elimination was passed, and this resolution originated from Minnesota. And you can see the text of that resolution, and I've highlighted some important components of that text in red. The National Pork Producers Council recommends working toward a united goal, very important, a united goal of eliminating the PRRS virus and eliminating the disease from the U.S. swine herd. The policy should support and identify resources and investments for accomplishing this goal. The policy must not make eliminating the PRRS virus a government mandate. So we're talking, everything we're talking is voluntary. We're not talking pseudorabies. We're not talking restricting pig movement. This is a voluntary program. So that's very important for everybody to understand and never forget. So that's another reason why I'm optimistic. Reason number 3 is we can eliminate PRRS virus from farms. We know how to do this. This has been done with many different ways. You can close your herd, you can depop, repop, you can test and remove. It's very repeatable, and it's been done years after year after year. Okay, so we know how to do this, okay? And number 4 for my optimism is we have the best veterinary diagnostic lab in the world. We clearly have a world-class veterinary diagnostic lab, which we know is so essential for understanding how this disease works. It's an invaluable state resource. I don't have to tell you that. I'm preaching to the choir. But we cannot emphasize enough how important our laboratory is for disease diagnosis, surveillance, and research. And because of the proactive approach that our diagnostic lab takes, we operate in real time when it comes to diagnosing PRRS virus. We've got molecular diagnostics, we've got sequencing, we've got real-time reporting. We get results in hours now instead of days or weeks. We're operating in real time. That's a huge advantage that we have over other diagnostic laboratories, not only in the U.S., but around the world. And so anytime you get a chance to help support this laboratory, just talking to somebody, writing a letter, putting a bug in somebody's ear, we got to take care of this important resource and make sure that it gets the funding it needs to keep it going. This is your laboratory. Now, while I am an optimist at heart, I understand some of the challenges that this disease poses to us, right? Just like trying to get on top of this hill and build this castle. Times are tough right now with PRRS. This has been a real tough period of time for us. The virus is undergoing continuous genetic change. You know, we had 184, then came 118.2, and then came 126.2, and then 144. This virus is continuing to change. New strains are emerging. They're tough to deal with. They're very pathogenic. They cause a lot of disease. They spread throughout the countryside very rapidly, more rapidly than they used to. There's a lot of good people working on vaccines, but we haven't had the slam dunk vaccine yet, like we had with pseudorabies. We may never get there. But there's some good products, and there's some good people working, but there's no silver bullet. So we've got to keep our fingers crossed that the research can lead the way and provide us with some real good vaccine technology in the future. And this has really been the toughest, what I'll call high-PRRS season that I've seen in recent years. You know, I still work in the field pretty much full-time as a professor from the university with applied research. So I'm in the field all the time, going to farms, working with a lot of you in the audience. And it's been the toughest high-PRRS season, meaning from October until, say, the end of the year. We have had so many new infections and lots of long-distance virus travels around the countryside. So I realize how things are, they're not very easy right now. Times are tough. So that's a little bit of background, okay? Where I've come from, why I do what I do, and why I feel that we have some of the main resources we need to move forward, but still realizing there are some challenges ahead. Now, one of the challenges is preventing reinfection. And I talked about this last high-PRRS season and how the virus is moving around the countryside and how it's been difficult to prevent reinfection. So let's take that topic right now. Key questions with preventing PRRS virus reinfection or spread between farms. Because we can get the virus out of the farm, but frequently the problem is a new strain gets in, and we don't really know how it gets in. So it's important we understand the routes of transmission and the biosecurity of the preventative measures to stop that. So let's talk about how it spreads between herds. And let's talk a little bit about airborne spread after that, because that's really my primary area of research. And I think we've made some great strides in that area. So we'll talk about spread in general and biosecurity in general, but then we're going to drill down and focus on aerosols and air filtration. Okay, so this little table is a summary of the routes of PRRS virus transmission and what we've learned in regards to how to reduce those risks, or what are the biosecurity protocols that we now know can stop these routes. And so we can just take this table real quick and break it down. So here we've got the route of spread, and we'll take them individually. Here we've got examples of each of those routes, and then the biosecurity intervention. So for example, we know that infected pigs or contaminated semen or even fresh pork can carry the virus into a farm. So that's old news. We know that for a long, long time. Those are what we call direct routes via the pig. So infected breeding stock, for example, infected contaminated semen, and even fresh pork meat can harbor the virus, and the juice from that pork meat on your hands can infect pigs. We published that a few years ago. And as most of us understand, when it comes to breeding stock, it's important that we buy from a negative source, and that's where the veterinarians can work together and make sure that your source of animals is free of the disease and free of the virus, and your semen comes from a boar stud which is free of the disease and free of the virus. And those genetics can come into a quarantine, and you can test them and be sure that they're free before they come into your herd. I mean, that's basic biosecurity 101, but we have to talk about it. Fresh pork meat, obviously there's a lot of prohibiting of entry into farms these days, now that we know that the virus can be in meat and the juice can infect animals. So that's fairly self-explanatory. The routes I've been working on extensively the last probably 10 years now at the university are what we call the indirect routes. These are the routes which don't necessarily involve a pig directly bringing the virus in. And so we've got fomites, which are inanimate objects like boots and coveralls, containers coming into your farms. That's why we change our boots and coveralls. That's why we have D&D rooms for supplies to come in and get properly sanitized before they come into your farms. Okay? So that's what we do. We understand the disinfectants that work the best against this. The Synergize product is the one we've used for years. That's the best disinfectant that I've had experience with for killing PRRS virus. And so we know how to reduce this risk by properly managing boots and coverall changes and disinfection of incoming supplies. People. We've done extensive work on whether people can carry the virus. And we know clearly without a doubt at this point in time, and I'm firmly committed to the future's fact that people don't carry this virus in their upper respiratory tract, in their nose, in their hair, in their ears, under their fingernails. We know that. We've tested it. But you can find it on the palms of your hands if you handle infected animals. And then you move directly and handle naive animals, you will move that virus via just handling animals. And so that's why we wash our hands. That's why we wear gloves. That's why we have our downtimes or our shower in, shower outs or whatever protocol is at your farm. That's how we reduce that risk of personnel entry. Okay, so we know that's very clear about people now. Transport, so trucking, contaminated trailers, sure. We've shown from work we've done in Minnesota that if you have a trailer that's contained infected animals, and you take those animals out and you don't do anything to that trailer before you put clean animals in, you will infect those clean animals. Pretty common sense. And we know how to clean those trailers up. We know how to disinfect them. We know what products to use. We know how to use a foamer. We know what concentrations. We know the contact time. And we know it's important to dry these trailers out. So using the proper disinfectants, as we talked about here, again, the Synergize product is the one we use, and then we dry them, we can reduce this risk of transport breach for biosecurity. Okay? Common sense. Bugs, a very low risk, especially this time of year, right? For moving the virus between farms. But mosquitoes and houseflies can move the virus and infect pigs. Okay? They can even travel out to about 1.5 miles in the air and carry live virus. But it's a very, very rare, infrequent event. I put it probably at the bottom of all of these risk factors as far as how I would rank them. And if you're really worried about insects, though, you can we've shown that if you screen the sidewall inlets, for example, of your finishing facilities, you can reduce insect entry, you can use insecticides, you can properly manage the habitat, you can do some basic pest control and reduce this risk. The real breakthrough for us has been learning about the airborne risk. And for many years, practitioners and producers would tell me, this virus is going by the air. I know it is, because we've got a sequence from one farm and it matches exactly the sequence from my farm, and this farm's right downwind and the air's blowing this way. And I had a little trouble proving that at first. I had a little trouble believing it, but I'm a clear believer now, and I'll show you why. And so a bioaerosol, which is really an aerosol from an infected pig, so a pig, as he excretes virus via the breath, that virus is in that bioaerosol and it can travel over long distance. I'll show you in a minute. And the solution for that is what we'll talk about, air filtration. So these are the routes of spread. And so one thing to take home today is we know how this virus moves between farms. There aren't any more mysteries of how this virus moves between farms. We understand them. That's a very important fact to take home today. And we've got things we can do about it to reduce the risk. Now, I talked about aerosols. Let's get into aerosols a little bit and let's talk about some of the filtration work in that. I just want to show you that we have proven that this virus can transmit long distances via the air. And we have a research farm in west central Minnesota where there aren't any pig farms for a 10-mile radius. And so we can actually bring pigs into the source population, which is a finishing barn right here. We can infect them with PRRS virus, and we can watch it spread in the countryside. And there aren't any other farms to infect. Obviously, we couldn't do this in a swine-dense region. But we can do it out where we are because we're so isolated. And so one day I took about 300 infected finishing pigs and I infected them with Minnesota 184, which was one of the viruses we talked about earlier, kind of the virus that emerged in about 2001 and really showed us the ability of it to travel long distances. Maybe some of you have dealt with 184. It's led to the other viruses like 118.2 and 126.2. They're getting tougher all the time. And they all seem to be able to travel long distances. But 184, we've actually caught air samples, or collected air samples at different points, radiating from this facility out to about 6 miles, about 5.7 miles, and showed that these air samples contained live virus. And we sequenced that virus to show that it came from this source. And there's nobody around here that would have given us a contaminating virus in the area. We're so isolated in this research site. And so we showed it's the same virus. It went at least 5.6 miles. That's as far as we looked. And this virus was live. We showed that even though that was just an air sample, that we could infect pigs with that air sample containing virus. And so it didn't die while I was traveling on this little experiment. It actually was still alive at all of these points you can see here on our map. Okay? So we know this is true now. There's no question about it. I'm now a firm believer in airborne transmission. And that's been a driver behind my wanting to understand the role of air filtration in reducing this risk. And it's been the primary focus of my research the last 5 years. Now, question 2 of those challenges, besides how does the virus spread, was how do we prevent airborne spread? And we mentioned air filtration, but let me show you some data from the field in a collaborating project that I'm working on with a number of clinics and pork producers and systems in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. Air filtration is the solution to this particular problem. Okay? But I'll warn you, first of all, you have to have good overall biosecurity in order to make this work. Obviously, this just prevents the airborne. If you don't have a good trucking program, if you don't have a good personnel program, you can bring the virus in from a lot of other ways, right? So this is really a comprehensive approach to biosecurity, but air filtration has been the missing link This has been the piece that producers didn't have in southern Minnesota, and they, despite really good protocols for all the other known routes, they would continue to become infected. Very frustrating. They clean up their herds and they break right away with a new virus, maybe within 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, over and over again. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that's really, really tough on the pocketbook, but also on your emotions and your psyche. So, I'll show you the data, but this technique continues to perform. We're now 28 months into a 4-year study, so we're actually going through a number of high PRRS seasons, and some pretty interesting results. These farms that I'm going to talk about are in very challenging regions of our state, as well as in northern Iowa. And I have to give a lot of credit to my 3 veterinary clinic colleagues and their groups that I'm working with on this project. Gordon Spronk from Pipestone, for example, Darwin Reichs from Swine Vet Center, and Paul Roon from Fairmont, as well as their partners and associates, are working together with me from the university and with their clients to see if this is something we can actually pull off and protect herds in southern Minnesota. Now, the good news is that boar studs, we've been filtering boar studs now for almost 5 years in a row, and none of these boar studs have broke. Over 25 studs or more now, we've got air filtration, and none of these studs have broke. Now these studs, if you look at their history before filtering, broke year after year after year after year. And so there's a great history saying that these studs were under high challenge all the time. So that's good. Breeding herds is a different challenge, obviously larger populations, bigger facilities, lots more people. It's a bigger challenge than a small boar stud. But right now, and I'll show you some data, we've got over 100,000 sows are currently under air filtration in this, across these 3 practices and their clients. That's a lot of sows. And there's a whole bunch more on the horizon that are going to put this in. So this is catching on in southern Minnesota and proving itself in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. Now, the project I'm going to tell you about is a project that's been funded in part by the PRRScap 2, which is a USDA initiative, the National Pork Board, and the Minnesota Pork Board. And so all of those folks who represent those organizations and have supported me over the years, I can't thank you enough. Now, the objective of this study was to evaluate the efficacy of air filtration for reducing the risk of reinfection. Maybe it won't be perfect, but can we reduce the amount of infections these farms get every year? Let's see. The project participants was myself, Steve Pohl, the ag engineer from SDSU, who helps design a lot of this filtration systems as far as the engineering, Pipestone, Fairmont, and Swine Vet Center. And we've had great relationships with the industry, with the filtration companies, with Camfilfar, with AP, with Biosecure Air, with Fenced Air. All these companies have really stepped up to help us. Novico, Claircor, a lot of these companies have really come forward with new products, innovative solutions to this problem. Now, this study is a 4-year study, and what we're measuring is what's the frequency of reinfection in these farms? Can we reduce this risk? And then eventually, what's the cost benefit? So right now, we've got 10 filtered farms that have gone long enough where I can show you some of the data. We've got a whole bunch of new filtered farms that are going to be part of the data set, but they're either in process of filtering or they haven't quite run the course yet to report to you. So I'm going to report to you what we've seen so far in our 10 filtered farms that have run for roughly 2 years or more, actually, in some cases, as well as our control farms. Farms which are matched in size, in biosecurity, except for they don't have a filter system. They've got a history of breaking year after year after year. And so we went out and tried to find these types of farms. Farms that are 2,400 sows and more in size. Farms that have had a history of an annual infection, every year a new virus. Farms that have tried everything to keep the virus out before they filtered. Okay? So, and farms obviously that are in a very dense region. I think this is a really cool chart, and so I'm going to take some time to explain this to you because we're starting to get a lot of traction, a lot of days. These are the 10 farms that I alluded to a minute ago that are under air filtration that are in our respective study. So here we've got days on the y-axis, and we've got farms on the x-axis. All right, so basically with this project, we started with 5 farms back in September of '08. Here are these 5 farms that have been involved in the project since the beginning of this project starting. We had a second group of farms start in September of '09, another set of 5. And as I mentioned, we've had actually about 10 new farms start this fall, but they aren't far enough along yet to talk about. Some of them aren't quite done filtering yet, so we have to wait until they're finished. But look at the days that these 10 farms are starting to accumulate without a reinfection. So some of these farms have gone almost 900 days and not had a PRRS virus infection, despite the fact they still are in those swine dense regions and they have a history of breaking year after year after year. Now, there have been 2 cases that I always mention where 2 of these farms have become infected with new viruses. We understand how it happened through transport and through personnel breach at the D&D room, best as we can tell. But what I want to focus on is that both of these farms got right back up, cleaned up the virus, are still under filtration, and are now up here. And so this is not a perfect technology if you don't have the rest of your program, solid as far as the other biosecurity interventions we talked about. I'm actually, I don't want to say glad, but we learned so much from these 2 farms. We improved so much because of these farms' experiences that we made it better. We made the protocols and the whole approach better. So I don't look at these as failures. These are learning experiences. And because of these farms and what they've done and what they've gone through and how they've improved, the whole industry will be better off. And because of some of those adjustments, we've got this second group now that as of today is cooking right along. That looks pretty good. So, now let's look at those 2 filtered farms that broke. And let me give you a little background on those 2 farms, because again, I don't consider these farms failing. I consider these farms learning and improving, because look at what they used to do. Here's their herd size, roughly 3,100, roughly 3,200. These are the number of farms out of their flow that surround them within a 3-mile radius. These are highly challenged farms. They're surrounded by barns that they don't send pigs to. Okay? They're getting challenged all the time by airborne virus. Now, if you looked at their diagnostic data from their veterinarians for the 4 years before they filtered, 48 months, here's the number of outbreaks of new viruses each of those farms experienced. Now, if you do the math over a 48-month period of time, that's 1 infection roughly every 7 months in the case of the first farm, and 1 infection every year in the case of the second farm. Now, since they've filtered 28 months of data, sure, there's been 1 break in each of those, but that's 1 infection every 28 months instead of every 6.8 months. And that's 1 infection every 28 months instead of every 12 months. That's improvement. That's improvement. So a lot of credit to that group who got back up on the horse, found the limitations, corrected them, and has continued to succeed. Now, what about the controls? These are the real eye-opening data. We've got control farms in this study, which are basically matched farms in size, density, history of breaks, biosecurity, except they don't have filtration. Over this 28-month period of time, of those 30 farms, 28 of those 30 farms have experienced a new virus introduction. That's 93% of those control farms have broke with a new virus. And if you break that down, of the 28 farms that have become infected, 17 of the 28 have broke once. 7 of the 28 have broke twice, 2 different viruses as determined by sequencing. And 4 poor buggers have broke 3 times over that 28-month period of time. And if you do the stats, you can see that the likelihood of reinfection in a filtered farm is significantly less than in a non-filtered farm. And we got to have those statistics to prove that this doesn't happen by chance. These are real data. Now, which group do you want to be in? Which group do you want to receive pigs from? Filtered? Non-filtered? I think I know the answer. All right. So that's why I'm excited about what's happening in the field and at the University of Minnesota and some of the progress we're making. But what also is exciting is what's happening elsewhere in regards to working together. How are we working together on what we call area regional control and elimination? What are some of these projects in the area as far as regional control of PRRS, regional elimination of PRRS? And I'm always very proud that the very first project that's referenced around the world now, where producers and practitioners got together and tried to do something on a large scale for PRRS, happened right in Minnesota. It happened right in Stevens County, in my old practice area, which makes me even more proud. It's right there. So there's Stevens. It inspired efforts across the country. And I'll show you a map that's got that activity laid out nice. But first, let's look at Stevens. This is the current map of Stevens County. Here are the borders of the county, right here. Now, if you looked at this map in 2004, basically every symbol, which signifies a farm, was red, meaning it was infected. Or maybe it was blue, meaning it was unknown. Now look at all the green, which means negative. Okay? So lots of green. That's good progress. We do have, I think this is an important story to tell, a new introduction of virus into Stevens County. It happened secondary to a sow farm breaking, and the pigs had to go somewhere. The pigs had to come into Stevens because that's where the building was. There was no option. We couldn't flow those pigs outside the county. But what I liked about it was the producer who had these infected pigs, who's been a part of this group, stepped forward and said, hey, I've got an infection. I got to move the pigs in. Here's the sequence. Here's the information. I'm going to share everything with the Stevens County group. And so we had a meeting not too long ago, and all of this was transparent. That's what we need. And now everybody in the area knows, okay? It's not that big of a deal because it's a nursery. The pigs will be gone in no time. But what I liked about it was the fact of how this producer stepped forward and felt comfortable in his group, which has supported each other since the beginning, and said, hey, this is happening. I don't want any of you to be surprised by this news if you heard it secondhand. I want you to know about it. I want you to know so you can be aware of this site. I want you to know so you can stay away from this site. So you might want to drive a different route. Here's the site. It'll be empty in a few weeks, but right now it's a red dot. That's producer leadership. That's how we're going to beat this thing. Now, Stevens has expanded. These are the surrounding counties around Stevens. So here's Stevens right here again. Here's that red dot. And here are the surrounding counties around Stevens. And you can start to see that we're working towards finding farms, getting them tested, getting them on a map, and finding out what their status is. And so again, green is negative, blue is either unknown, or they haven't signed a release form to put their data on the map yet. We have to honor that. And then there are a few red dots in the area, at least so far. But Stevens is expanding. And it's expanding even farther to what we call North 212. And Dr. Monsi Toremare is here, who, along with Bob Morrison, is the leader of this project. And the North 212 project is kind of based on the old North 212 pseudorabies line, where here's 212 right down here. And so we're trying to understand what's north of 212. Mapping farms, determining status, just getting a good understanding of what's north of 212. And so here's Stevens. And here are some of the farms down here, obviously a few positives, and there's a bunch of unknowns, or people haven't turned their consent form in yet. But, you know, we're starting to get a good picture of what's happening around Minnesota. And here's what's happening around the U.S. This is even more exciting. These are all the projects that Beringer, Ingelheim, and practitioners and producer groups are working together to try to do this outside of just Minnesota. So here's Minnesota and the North 212 project, and here's the North Dakota project that Jim alluded to as a potential project. But look at all these other projects where other producers and other practitioners are learning from what we did in Minnesota, or what we're doing in Minnesota, and trying to replicate it, using a lot of the same protocols. Finding a region, building a team, making a map, testing the farms, putting strategies together to clean up. It's happening all over the U.S., and it's happening in Canada, and it's happening in Mexico. I only have information for U.S., but it's happening in North America is a take-home message. And they're all in different stages, and they're all learning, and everybody's sharing. We're all learning from one another. We just had a meeting in Chicago in December where all of the leaders of these projects came forward and talked about what was happening in their respective project. And we discussed, and we learned, and we understood that there were some limitations and some pitfalls. And we learned that there were some successes, and we shared those, and we talked about it, and we got better. That's exciting to me. All right, so we've talked about some background. We've talked about preventing reinfection, working together. Let's bring it to a close. I'm excited. I'm optimistic because we have, as we talked earlier, producer and veterinary leadership. We know we can eliminate PRRS virus from herds. We have a world-class veterinary diagnostic laboratory. And we are learning how to prevent reinfection with some of the biosecurity protocols, especially the air filtration that we talked about earlier. And we are working together. That's exciting. And so to open up for discussion, I'd like to pose a challenge that this is the last decade of PRRS. Or is it the last decade of PRRS?